Welcome to the Procuretech Podcast, where we aim to excite and inspire you about how technology will shape our profession's future. I'm your host, James Meads, and I worked in corporate procurement for 16 years before starting my own business as a content creator and consultant in the procurement technology space. I'm deeply convinced that procurement must become less technocratic and embrace the entrepreneurial spirit and creativity if we're ever going to shake off our image of being a process-obsessed, box-ticking function. You definitely won't find vanilla content on here, and we're not afraid to tackle some controversial topics and tell it like it really is. So if that's your thing, now let's jump right into this week's episode. Yes, hello, and a very warm welcome to another episode of the Procuretech Podcast. We are the official podcast of procurementsoftware.site, where you can search, filter, analyze, and look up over 330 procurement software solutions in less time than it takes you to boil an egg. We don't have any complicated solution maps. We don't charge you a fortune to access our data. It's all there on our website that you can search completely free, because at the end of the day, we want to help procurement professionals like yourselves to really be able to find and discover the breadth of the market of solutions out there. There's lots of great tech that really just no one knows about, and that's what we're all about, and indeed what this podcast is all about. And my guest today is from the generative AI space, and we're going to have a conversation about how he came from that industry and really identified a problem that was out there in the procurement space, despite not really having much background or knowledge of what procurement did up until that point. So Forestreet is a supplier search and intelligence platform, and I'm joined today by their co-founder and CEO, David Doyle. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you for having me.
So, David, you're a tech guy, as we spoke about in the past, rather than a procurement guy, and I'm hoping we can throw the analogy that you used in one of the prep calls that we had into this interview that actually made me spit out my words, laugh out loud when you compared procurement to a certain football team. We'll keep this tense and we'll throw that one in a little bit later. But first of all, just maybe give everyone a bit of a background just to contextualize how you came from this space and how you landed in essentially now being a founder of a procurement tech company.
Yes, it's not been a straightforward journey. So key thing for your listeners to understand is I'm fairly old. When I started kind of working with tech, it was actually in the MRP space, which then evolved into ERP space. So I was doing lots of kind of multifunctional systems implementations. I was never particularly close to the procurement space. I was in finance quite a lot, but ended up sort of project managing those jobs. And I got more and more interested in the analytics space. So I started to, as the sort of early versions of data warehouses started to come out, and the use of data to solve business problems became more and more important in business. I sort of jumped onto that train and eventually became sort of a specialist in data analytics. And as I sort of thought about more and more the applications of those things, and typically thinking about the application within an organization, how to use an organization's data. But one of the things that happened latterly was actually started to realize just how much information was outside the enterprise, and how, and the rate of growth of that information. So started to think about how you might utilize that information for the benefit of companies. And to some extent, the genesis of Forestreet was really about understanding that there's a mindset about all the knowledge being within an organization was just breaking down effectively. And there was a very specific problem we were looking at the time. We were looking at sort of the technology market research industry and thinking, it feels a little bit it doesn't feel quite right. Everyone's a little bit uncomfortable. It can be, not naming names, a pay-to-play model. You have to do a lot of PR to get to be noticed as a technology company in this space. And so we thought there's two things we can apply to this, one of which is independence, like a genuinely independent perspective. So we worked for the buyers, not the sellers exclusively. And then the second one was actually about the use how data really can overcome the cognitive constraints, the idea that one individual can know everything there is to do about a technology category. We just felt it was broken. There were too many new technology types. Even in the procurement space, so many different types of technology application. How could one consultant or expert really track all of those? And so that's a data analytics opportunity. And that was a 30-year journey that got us to the genesis of Forestreet ultimately. So we started there saying, right, technology market research looks like something, an industry that needs to be fixed. And then we sort of stumbled sort of sideways into procurement by realizing we built this sort of B2B search capability. And there was no reason it could be pointed at things which were non-technology. So if you wanted to find any type of supplier or vendor or understand a sort of a category capability, it was really well suited to that task. And so when we talk about stumbling into procurement, that was the journey almost. It turns out we got this really sort of capable technology. We hadn't thought to focus it on this problem, but as it turns out, it's actually a very valuable application.
Yeah, and you mentioned there's a phrase that you mentioned as well when we were prepping this. That good solutions are always a bundle of technologies, and if we bear in mind that there are other suppliers scouting tools out there that do certain aspects of what Forestreet does, what do you mean by that?
Well, the good thing about my experience is I'm not a deep technologist. I've always been sort of focused on a client outcome, a good delivery. And so there's a sort of, I coined the phrase, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And typically what you find is with people are sort of deep technology specialists, they often want to sort of close the last 20% of a problem by just, refining the algorithm down to sort of to perfection. But the last 20% is a journey that almost never ends, right? So you think about, well, are there smarter ways to do this by combining different types of approaches, or actually just putting humans into the process at a point where they can add the most value? And so when we approach the problem of doing something with a massive amounts of data, we always said, well, let's think about a combination of approaches. So there isn't a perfect algorithm that can find the answer to your problem, but there are combinations or ensembles of technology that can take you 80% of that journey really quickly. And that's the design principle that sits behind the way we approach it, which is let's make it effective. Let's not convince ourselves that just somehow by being very clever and working amongst ourselves we'll come up with a perfect solution. And that's an approach I think has been consistent throughout certainly my working life, which is, you're going to end up with combinations of technology that are going to give you results if you try and do everything with a single bullet. And generative AI, I think, is going to be a really good example of this. It'll be brilliant at some things, but not so good at others. And so you might want to combine it with other types of tech to get to the outcome that you want. Don't think it's the answer to everything, because I've never seen one technology that really is the answer to everything.
I love that, because especially now with ChatGPT, everyone is seemingly using it for everything. And if we can maybe take that as an example that a lot more people will understand, anyone that's used ChatGPT to do basic internet search will probably, I hope, realize that it's pretty dreadful at that. It tends to hallucinate and it tends to, or even outright lie in some cases. When can that actually be an advantage rather than a potential banana skin? Are there cases when that can actually be beneficial?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, again, it's understanding the sort of the right tool for the right job. So generative AI is an extraordinarily powerful assistant, an augmentation. I want to write a policy. I need to write a sustainability policy around a particular category. Can you recommend what should be included within that? That's a brilliant question for ChatGPT. Can you give me the most up-to-date policy on sustainability? In that is a terrible use of generative AI, because they'll make one up, right? So and I had a great conversation with some of the guys at IDC who were saying, no matter how many parameters, the initial thinking is, no matter how many parameters you train your generative AI model on, the hallucination is a feature, not a bug. So what it does is it's got a creative engine, right, which can really help you to do your job. But it as you mentioned, it isn't search, right? It can't find, understand that the latest document you're looking for is 3.2.4, which supersedes 3.2.3. And so you need to be using this one. That's not what generative AI does. And I've been quite worried actually with some of the client conversations I've had recently, where they just think we're just going to throw our knowledge base at it and job done, right? And then we don't have to worry about indexing or data curation or any of the sort of the good old-fashioned disciplines which they've grown up with. And I think that's quite a dangerous myth that's out there in the marketplace right now. I think there's a few $1 million going to get burnt before people realize that's not the case. Yeah.
So having this tool at your fingertips, what you've developed is, it's obviously a great advantage in terms of being able to get to your destination in a much shorter time, as you said, to get unlike John Bon Jovi, who's only halfway there, if you can get 80% of the way there, I had to get that one in. If you can get 80% of the way there and then you just need a human to do the final 20%, that kind of then brings us back to the age-old point that we always seem to come back on, is then, okay, well, how can procurement then sell their added value to stakeholders? And we come across this time and time again, don't we, that how can procurement then, with the addition of technology and with the help of technology, how can something like a Forestreet assist procurement to become seen as being a more valued business partner?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we spoke before, I talked about my having come to procurement late, but having seen the business partnering conversations that were going on in the finance function, the HR function, how do we get to be strategic advisors to the business? And having seen that sort of play out, it's interesting to come into the procurement conversation right now and think, I can see a whole number of parallels here. So, and there's maybe some different nuances. So one of the things that you're in procurement, we have this conversation we're talking about is how do we respond faster and more with better evidence back to the business? How can we outpace the business, right, in terms of our ability to understand the options that are available to them? And generative AI is something sort of really powerful in that sense. If you're saying, give me some summaries, give me some ideas, things that we might throw out there, then generative AI uses that really well. And it can augment the procurement function in terms of that, creating a richer conversation with the business. And I think that's really powerful. I'm also struck, however, by how much the procurement function tends to think of technology as an automation tool, right? And it's about cost out, it's about faster, more for less. And I think this is really interesting because it's sort of, I was hearing some CPOs having a conversation about how they're struggling to get the adoption of digital technologies within the procurement function. And I kind of think, well, if you stand outside and listen to that dialogue, it sounds a lot like you're asking turkeys to vote for Christmas. So I'd like you to run a project to make procurement a more technology-orientated function. And that means you're going to sack a whole number of your colleagues. That's what good looks like. We'll have less procurement people doing with more output. And I don't think that's a particularly great sales pitch for adoption within an organization. I think the idea of thinking of this technology, and particularly the generative AI, as an augmenter, it's a superpower for the procurement advisor that gets them into that space where they can now provide really value-added and insightful sort of perspective to the business, I think is a real opportunity. But I think you have to think about this augmentation versus automation. It's very different, right? And I think you need to approach it in a different way and sell it in a different way.
Don't you think they kind of both go together, though? So I was just going to say, I understand the angle that you're coming from, but I would almost split it into two segments. And I would say operational, transactional procurement, I think, is something that needs to be automated and will be automated over time. And I think that the strategic procurement or category management or procurement leadership roles shouldn't be involved in that anyway, but inevitably they do get involved in it because it's often outsourced to BPOs, or the people that are doing it don't have the capability or the authority to deal with problems that get escalated. But if that does get automated and we take out a lot of the human error, like accounts payable losing invoices or something not getting updated in an ERP system, that type of thing, inevitably that will lead to the removal of certain entry-level procurement function. And I do think that will be inevitable. But surely that's something that we should be encouraging to enable someone at a more senior level, functional expert in procurement, to be able to have the time then to spend on something like developing and nurturing stakeholder relationships, and then coming back to the original conversation with generative AI and how can that do a lot of the spade work for the procurement manager in terms of getting them 80% of the way there to be able to sort of have that data-driven conversation. Isn't that where we need to get to? So as the augmentation role that you're talking about, the procurement manager at least does have some bandwidth to tackle that.
Yes, actually, so I agree. And I think actually business partnering is impossible unless you get to that like a smooth running operational base. So there's no point having a very strategic conversation when the basics don't work. Suppliers aren't getting paid, as you say. Invoices are going missing. We don't have effective records of who our suppliers are. So I'm actually not arguing for that. I'm saying there's two quite different approaches, two lenses to apply to this. One of which is, what you want is silent running of the operational base. That's really good. And there's no way you can evolve. No matter how good the other technology is, you can't get to that business partnering, strategic insight conversation unless you've fixed the noise elsewhere. So I think there are two parts of it. I guess what I would suggest is that often procurement function is very much focused on automation. And then what do we do with the space? There's not a clear view in terms of how to use that sort of excess capacity and space. So you've got to do it in parallel. And I think to some extent, that's a bit to go back to what you alluded to at the beginning. This is why I sometimes see them as the Millwall FC of the corporate functions, almost like job is to be unpopular, basically. And, who cares if we're not if the business don't like us, because we've got a job to do, which is to squeeze the cost base. And actually, I think it's very hard to go on this journey without thinking of these two sides of it: automation and augmentation. That's the building blocks to get you to that business partner aspiration.
So for anyone that doesn't understand football, who are Millwall FC and why does everyone hate them?
Millwall FC they've built a legend around themselves and the fan base, which is they're just a desperately unpopular club, basically. But it's part of the kudos now, right? So it's part of how you get to belong. If you support Millwall, it's like you're standing out and saying, "I'm unpopular. I don't care. We do what we do," and that's the sort of our exceptionalism, basically. So that's the football analogy. I'm not saying. I think, frankly, that's. If Millwall FC had the budget of Man City, I don't think they'd really want to be that unpopular anymore. So I think it's making a virtue of necessity to some extent.
But going back to that, though, do you think procurement's unpopularity in some organizations or apathy to work with procurement stems from the fact that procurement doesn't really understand or empathize with some of the priorities that lie there within the business? Or do you think it's just the fact that they're only being measured on cost savings, and that's what's driving them because that's what ultimately they're assessed on?
Yeah, I actually think it's a big part of it. The fact that it's such a simple, easy set of metrics about cost out, more for less. It's measurable. Everyone understands it, and so it drives a certain sort of behaviour. I think the breakthrough, for all of these business partnering aspirations across any function is pace. So you have to be faster than the business, right? So if the business says, I've got a problem around X, I need a business problem to solve. I don't need a widget. I need to understand how to solve a problem. Until the sort of support function is faster at providing the options and answers than the business partner thing doesn't quite work. You'll just always end up with this mishmash of, you get procurement come to the party late, but the business has already moved on. They've bought a kind of a solution, maybe not the best one, and they've now just tried to stuff it into a process because it fixes the problem for now. And it's the pace, and this is where I think again the really big opportunity for this sort of to use these new tools, I think is really there. It's like how to understand how to deploy them, be faster, come back to the business before they've had the chance to break open Google and go off and sort of discover, or go to a conference and discover kind of here's a way we might solve it, or pick up some random theories. I mean, my experience of corporate life is that there's so many kind of corridor random conversations that end up being implemented, sometimes for millions of dollars, because, the CEO bumped into someone he knew and said, "Oh, this is a really cool tool. Why aren't we using this?" And the pressure comes down the chain, and all of a sudden there's a project stood up, and no one quite knows why. But it's but something has to be seen to be done, right? And until you can lead the pace of that conversation, random stuff is going to carry on getting done. I think that's just operational, busy business people. They just have to get things off their to-do list.
So can you maybe give us a few examples then of how generative AI could assist procurement into getting away from this very reactive or more cost-driven mindset and, as we alluded to, be seen as more of a business partnering function and an internal, almost an internal consultancy that can leverage technology to get us to the solutions of those problems faster?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can obviously talk about the type of work that we do for clients, or your clients do on our platform, in terms of understanding kind of how to navigate new categories, for instance. So you're looking to kind of move. Maybe a good example would be for a distillery you work with. You want to move onto a sort of the next step of your sustainability journey. In this case, it was sustainable labeling. Okay, well, what is sustainable labeling? What types of sustainable labeling? Where does sustainable labeling get made? No one's got that on a shelf, right? So that report doesn't exist. So if you go have to stand up and come back to the business with options in terms of this is how we could go about it, that's where the sort of the technology, the AI that we can provide to clients is super valuable, because you can say, I'm going to define something new. I'm going to decide, what the scope of that category is. I'm going to decide geographically where I want to find it, and I'm going to build that myself, because actually as I find out more about it, I'm likely to change the parameters of my search. And that's not so no one's going to build that report for me. I'm going to go and build that, and then I can bring it back to the business and say, okay, I've got a comprehensive view of everything in this marketplace. We can now make some strategic decisions. We did something similar for one of the bit large retail banks, which is about a technology category which they're trying to explore, which is really around voice to text technology. And okay, so voice to text technology is there's call center stuff, there's customer care components, there's compliance components. So is this a horizontal capability across the bank, or am I going to buy point solutions? And how can I make a recommendation to the business about where they might go forward, unless I understand what the entire category looks like? And then you can sort of start to, it's very different in banking than it is in medicine, than it is in other industries. So you kind of got very strict parameters. You go and understand that, and then you can say, okay, I tell you what, here's the innovation. Here's the sort of the really big players. Here's what they can do, what they can't do. And here's, and here's the opportunities in terms of doing something which is one size fits all, or just going point by point. But unless I've got a comprehensive view, I can't really give good advice on that, can I? And I've got a bunch of incumbent suppliers, most likely, that are saying, oh, my tool's the best. They can bend people's ears and say, yeah, no, we can sort of do that. So no, why not just stick with us? It's all going to be okay. Well, you've got no leverage, no negotiating power, no information advantage that you can take into that conversation. And that's, I think, where you're going to get that trip from a sort of a go off and execute a process to let's have a really rich conversation about what are genuinely our options, and even within our options, what's mature, what's not mature, right? Is this? How do we feel as an institution in terms of going for the bleeding edge versus the very well established? Let's have a conversation. That's the richness I think you can bring to those conversations.
So if I'm paraphrasing you a little bit, then it's getting you to the point where you can have a meaningful data-driven conversation a lot faster than you would have been able to previously. And if we go back even just 10, 15 years, that would have been either a lot of Googling or using these or using these directory websites, which are virtually useless because they're never kept up to date, or it would have been an expensive consultancy project, right? Because we're moving away from, if we go back maybe a bit further, if you go back to the 1980s, 1990s, where typically you would have had a procurement manager that would have managed the same category of spend, perhaps for 10, 15, 20 years. Those subject matter experts, not always, but in a lot of cases now, are starting to retire. And typically most corporates, especially sort of British, American corporates, tend to follow a policy of rotating their category managers and procurement professionals around different areas of spend every 3 or 4 years. And you get people coming into the profession now that are maybe experienced career professionals, but are not experienced category managers for the area of spend that they're coming into to manage. So technology nowadays, in the way that procurement has professionalized and evolved as a function, the soft skills and some of the aspects around compliance and due diligence are now being viewed a lot higher than necessarily very deep specific category knowledge, because we've got technology now that's able to do a part of that.
I think so. I think there's a big macroeconomic driver as well. They talk about, polycrisis and, a world of shocks. I think that's another driver. As you said, there's a generational shift perhaps, but I think there's also very much an economic shift, which is we can't bank on stability, right? So this idea of optimization as the goal always, as opposed to the responsiveness. What do we do if, we've got to shorten our supply chain? We've got to, all of a sudden there are sort of, we've had the energy crisis, right? So certain commodities become really expensive to produce, or certain supply chains get cut. How do you respond to that? Because it's the tool set, I think, is changing along with the generation. And I think my suspicion is, again, as an outsider, is that the basic architecture of a procurement function is going to change on that basis.
I completely agree with you, 100%. I think procurement will, at least in the forward-thinking organizations, I think in 5 to 10 years' time, the way that the function is structured in terms of the job descriptions and the type of headcount that you're getting into it is going to be vastly different from how it looks now. I mean, I think even now, it's starting to look outdated in terms of what the business is asking for versus you ask procurement leaders in all of these surveys, the biggest thing that they always speak about is we're struggling to attract and retain the right talent. And is it because of salaries? Possibly to a certain extent, but also it's just a lot of career procurement people don't necessarily have the training and the skill set for what the biggest issues are now. Yeah, I think 100%, especially if you look across a diverse portfolio of what, as a department, procurement will need going forward. Yes, you will always need category managers with certain expertise, particularly in very complex categories like IT or like packaging, where it's where category expertise is really, really relevant. But in some of the more generalist roles, when we talk about things like business partnering and being seen as a valuable business partner, things like copywriting and marketing and into influence and persuasion and just being able to understand and get involved in the objectives of the business and to be able to, or even just be able to lobby your CFO to get some budget for some tech. I think that's procurement is terrible about that, aren't they? I mean, you've probably come across it yourself as essentially every CEO is a salesperson, right? I mean, you I'm sure you've come across that when you've had a client that's interested but just can't find the budget to buy what you're selling them.
Great. Yeah, I think this idea that kind of the churn almost of categories. Obviously, you kind of your direct spend on your products is kind of we're broadly consistent, but ESG is a great driver, where you need to look not just at a sort of alternative supplies of the widget. You need to look at alternative ways of delivering the outcome, right? And so I think the speed and the breadth, the agility that you'll need to demonstrate as a procurement function is just going to grow, because the questions will be more varied and they'll come faster. And so how do you respond to that? And as I said, and that's kind of a very interesting journey for us in Forestreet, sort of, if you like, wandering into that space and sort of say, oh, right, okay, this is, it's not just technology research that's got that issue. Every other piece of sort of, this kind of business to business resource finding is just becoming more and more urgent, more and more diverse. And I think that's that's an interesting moment. It'd be interesting to see how people grasp it, right? Do they hunker down and say we're okay, or and we'll firefight when need to, or do we say no, we need to really rethink what's the portfolio we're looking after? How much of it is static? How much of it is moving? What does that mean in terms of how we design the function? Right? It's like where does the function connect into the business? That was always a big problem with lots of the business partnering journeys: is which part of the business you're trying to connect with, and how, and if you are, then think about the moments of truth. What are the moments of truth for procurement? I don't know, but actually it's a great exercise to think about. Well, if you understand the moments of truth as in when you're really going to make a difference, then you kind of start to understand the technology and the capabilities you need to build in order to deliver on that.
Indeed. And this area of technology that you're into, this generative AI space, it's a very, very fast moving part of the technological space. So how do you evolve that? I know one of the things that you're really passionate about is perfection is the enemy of good. So how do you evolve your tool and constantly implement new technological features and adapt and grow with your customers in such a fast-paced environment?
So we take a modular approach to everything, right? So the idea is that we would never bet the farm on just generative AI. So we apply it to a piece of process. So in some extent, you think about, we take a vast amount of unstructured data and we turn it into structured data. And there's a production line that sits between one end of that and the other. And along the production line, there are different machines. And so we might take out a machine and replace it or test it. But we're thinking about the surrounding kind of the QA around it. A great example would be asking ChatGPT to give you examples of a particular type of supplier is quite good, right? But you might want to put next to that something which just does a sort of very old-fashioned check to make sure the website is real, because it does make up stuff. So it's quite good at creating checks. Put in a little check that says, can we just ping the website, make sure it's doing what ChatGPT is telling us, in which case you allow it to go into the next part of the production process. And all along that workflow, you're trying to think about, how do I sort of get the best out of it, but also put the checks and balances to make sure that as the product goes to the next stage of its sort of engineering, that it's actually being improved and enhanced. And so those are the sort of things, are the smarts you can do around using something like generative AI smartly, and then also understanding, as we were talking earlier on in the podcast, about what's the right tool for the right job. Right? There are some old, it's just some sad old fashioned process flows and gate technology which do just as well as the smartest generative AI algorithm. That's something you just got to think about. What's the risks, rewards, and what's the nature of the product in terms of how absolutely reliable does it have to be? Again, think about it in our earlier context, which was very good at idea generation, a great assistant researcher, sort of suggester of ideas, but not, as someone found to their cost recently, a lawyer. They're persuasive, but they're wrong, right? So that's that's a great way of sort of divining what's a good application.
So just conscious of the time and about to wrap this up. So before I ask people where they can find you if they want to learn more about the solution, what would be the one tip that you would give to the listeners if they were looking at exploring this as a general theme of something that they wanted to bring into their business, but they didn't really know where to start? What due diligence should they be doing on the supply base, or how can they inform themselves a little bit more around, as you say, the strengths, but also the limitations of this type of technology?
So I think there's a flood of information about there, and I think it's worth taking the sort of the different perspectives. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly. There are people who are evangelists. There are people who are sort of completely down on this new generation of technology. I think my guidance is to force yourself to read both ends of that argument, because neither of them are right, but they've all got valuable things to say. So I think it's at the moment I'd get out of it, whatever echo chamber you're in, I'd get out of it and listen to someone else's opinion on it, because it'll at least frame it in a way which is give you some clues about, okay, I can see how this might solve some problems in my business. And then actually, the great thing about these new generation of tools is they're super easy just to do the fairly light testing on. You can go out there, experiment, ask questions, iterate, and then get a sense of actually before I go and talk to my boss and say I've got a really good idea, make sure that you're confident that you've really got something which has got legs. I think that's the way to do it. But it's the volume of stuff that's out there is phenomenal, and I'd make use of it.
Awesome. So final question, David. So we did a live demo actually with Forestreet back in February, which is on our YouTube channel. And I'll link to that in the show notes for anyone that's listening, if you want to just get a bit of a look and feel of how Forestreet looks. But otherwise, where's the best place for people to reach out to you, David, if they'd like to learn more?
Yeah, Forestreet.com, info at Forestreet. We're all here. We're a small team. And what we love to do is test cases. Give us something with meaningful challenges behind it, and that's a great, if people want to test our platform, it's a great way to do it. Do a live or a legacy test. We love to be benchmarked.
Fantastic. David, thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure, and always interesting for me when I learn from my guests, and every day's a school day in this case, because I know very little about this space. So thanks for coming on.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.
So that was generative AI and how it can benefit you and what the potential limitations are in the procurement space. Thank you very much for listening to the show. There are a lot of procurement podcasts out there these days, so I'm very, very pleased that you've chosen to put us into your earballs today. And don't forget, if you like what you've heard, then please go ahead and give us a review on Apple Podcasts so as we can help to reach more people. Until then, we will catch you at the same time next week. Until then, take care and bye for now.